unimaginative. Hello, Houston. We're going to finish up our discussion of comprehension of language today and move into production of language. We are a little bit behind the announced schedule, and we will catch up on this and the next tape so that we finish everything by the end of the next lecture that's going to be covered in the second exam, which will be coming up here just in the next week or so. So in essence, I want to kind of jump right into the middle here and remind you that what we were talking about was essentially this rule system. We had just finished last time talking about phrase structure grammar, which is, of course, the rules that govern language regularity. And in fact, what I'm going to do now is to show you how we apply those when we start generating tree diagrams. Okay, we're going to be involved in the parsing of sentences, kind of in the way that English teachers do, although from a different perspective. English teachers are telling us how to write good sentences using the diagramming, and in fact, psycholinguists are using I started to say psycholinguistics, so I emphasized it wrong, but psycholinguists are basically about the business of trying to figure out what you and I are doing when we're communicating with each other. And it leads into the following kind of an analysis of sentences. So for instance, if we look at a statement such as, "The girl looked at the boy with the telescope," if you think about that for a second, that is an ambiguous sentence. It can be interpreted in at least two different ways, and I'm going to pick only two to analyze it with. But in fact, if you look at it this way, this is one way. I'm going to call this sentence A. And basically, this is one way to interpret the sentence. And if we do it in this manner, it can be interpreted to mean that the girl looked at a boy who was carrying a telescope or who was with the telescope. Okay, and so in that way, it will then allow us to do things like predicting pauses. For instance, in this sentence, that's where the major pause would be. It would not hurt you at all or pain you to hear somebody say something like, "The girl looked at the boy with the telescope." There's a secondary pause that will occur right here, simply because of the fact that we've now gotten through the major pause occurs because the load on the speaker's mind has been reduced significantly. In that particular sentence, the noun phrase is now completely finished. The girl is all that person is going to offer up, and so at this point, that person can shift into a description of or an analysis of an organization of whatever verb phrase he's going to end up using. There is a secondary pause here because, as you can see again from the diagram, what he shifted from is the verb half of the verb phrase into a variety of prepositional phrases which are going to follow shortly. And so there might even be, that we could argue, another pause here because, as we noted, in this case we're talking about someone who looks at a boy who has a telescope. And so the prepositional, or the noun phrase, the direct object of that sentence is simply boy with the telescope. And so there might be a secondary pause in that sentence in which the intonation might imply to you what the meaning of the sentence is that somebody's saying to you. The girl looked at the boy with the telescope, okay, would convey that to us. But let's look at it in another way. And that is to think of it as another kind of organization. Whoops, I'm going the wrong direction here. Same sentence, let's organize it this way instead. Well, why is my button going the wrong direction here? Now let's look at it as the boy, again, the girl, looked at the boy with the telescope. But notice where the secondary pause is. Because in this case, the intonation might be something like the girl looked at the boy with the telescope. And by putting the pause after boy instead of before it, what the speaker has done is to imply simply that the girl in the sentence is using a telescope to look at the boy. Okay? And so it's the parsing of the sentence that allows us to use, for instance, the pauses of the speaker to indicate what in fact is being done, what the speaker is in fact communicating in that situation. So here's a case where the tail wags the dog. That is that the speaker is the one who dictates by his or her pauses what form of sentence or message is actually being communicated. And you can see here that where the pauses are really indicates to us what the person who's speaking is actually saying in that situation. And so in essence, when we look at the benefits of diagrams, there are actually several, okay? This tree diagram is of a simple sentence, shows the relationship of the words to one another and the role played by each in the sentence. So it describes for us, it spells out the specific interrelationships, what's a preposition, where the pauses are likely to be, and so forth. So essentially, this structure, when we create it, allows us to predict where we'll pause in reading or saying a sentence. Just as a specific example here, this is a more simplistic example, but in essence, after which word would you be most likely to expect a pause here? Somebody can get on the mic and tell me, make a guess. Where would you be most comfortable with a pause? If I were to say to you, the boy likes the girl, do you expect that as an enunciation on my part? How about the boy likes the girl? After which word is that pause most likely to come? Go ahead. Yeah, it's unanimously boy. So we're going to go back to the diagram now and look at it here. And this is the place where you expect it to occur. Where might there be a secondary pause in this particular sentence? After which word? And again, you just need to look at the sentence structure to see that it's going to be right there. Because again, what the structure tells us is that that person has now finished with the verb half of the verb phrase that was intended in that case. So you might hear the boy likes the girl. You might even hear somebody say the boy, or the boy likes the girl. But as I intoned a minute ago, you're never going to hear someone say the boy likes the girl. That pause is just abnormal, given the way we normally talk to each other in English. So in essence, by looking at the diagram of the sentences, we can predict where those pauses will occur. And it's interesting that if you look at the overall diagram of this sentence, it's just not going to be the case that we find a pause after the second the. That's just never going to happen, given the way we communicate with each other. But in fact, fumbles and pauses, when you look at sentences, tend to occur in a long sentence. They're much more likely to occur at a phrase boundary than mid-phrase anywhere. In the example I gave you a minute ago, the boy likes the girl is a phrase. And you're never going to hear a pause between that. Normally we speak to each other in phrases. And so the diagramming of the sentences does allow us to make certain predictions about how it will be intoned to us as we're using it. So Chomsky's major contribution in all of this had to do with the fact that what he did was to broaden out the focus of psycholinguistics, basically to emphasize not just intra-sentence, that is within sentence relationships among words and phrases, but also he looked at the syntactic relationships between sentences, leading to discourse as an analytic model. But the problem is, and we fumble right into another problem here, and that is that the problem that we have with this is the fact that sentences with similar meanings may have very different tree structures. I'll show you some examples of that here in a minute, but we may have sentences that have the same meaning with very different structures, and the corollary to that is, of course, that we may have sentences that have very similar or identical structures that have very different meanings, okay? And now let me show you some examples of this. I'm going to put them up singly, but I will put them together on the screen in a minute so you can compare them directly to see what I'm talking about. But the two sentences that I'm going to put up here in just a second, one of them is, Randy eagerly swallowed the python. Roll with me on this example. But Randy eagerly swallowed the python is a simple declarative sentence. And in fact, we can diagram it this way. It simply is following the fundamental rule that we were looking at right at the very beginning, reviewing right at the very beginning of the lecture, and that is the sentence is noun phrase plus verb phrase. And so in this case, that's the way this sentence would be diagrammed. But if you look at it, we can also say this in another way. The python was swallowed eagerly by Randy. Okay, so the original sentence we started with, Randy eagerly swallowed the python, is the one we started with, but look at the diagram we get when we do the second one. The python was swallowed eagerly by Randy. The effects are the same. That is, the meaning in both of those situations are exactly the same. They show very little similarity when we examine their phrase structure. But the only difference there is this is a passive voice and the previous one was an active voice. That's really the only difference. And so if you compare them, there are huge differences in the structure there, But in fact, the net effect on Randy and the Python is exactly the same. That's a problem, okay? There's another problem, and that is that we can compare, I'll show you two other pairs of sentences. The Python eagerly swallowed Randy. That's the other version of what may in fact happen, of course. And then a second element of that is to look at it in the following perspective. So again, sentences with similar meanings have very different tree diagrams. Compare this one with this one. Randy was swallowed eagerly by the Python. Passive voice again, but look at the tremendous difference in the structure of the sentence, even though the meaning that's conveyed by either of those to you is exactly the same. And so when we put them up together, you can see that in fact they have exactly the same meaning, but the effect is quite different in terms of how you diagram it. It seems to me that a good grammar should include some way of explaining that sentences with related tree diagrams can have such disparate meanings. There's got to be some way in our analysis of language to be able to communicate that. And this is what led to the emphasis by psycholinguists on the relationship among different phrase structures, how the structures relate to each other. Chomsky emphasized, for instance, understanding transformations of elements within a given sentence. And that in turn led to a whole different kind of analysis of sentence structure, and it refers to what I'm going to define for you here as essentially transformational grammar. And in fact, the syntax is what we're going to be concerned with here specifically, that is word order. But these are essentially rules governing modification of linguistic forms which preserve the original meaning, so that they're going to be a system by which we can convey essentially the same thing, but maybe do it in different orders or with different structures. Okay, so to preserve the original meaning, for instance, if the intent of a message is something like the boy was loved by the girl, it can be transformed in ways so that the girl loved the boy achieves exactly the same effect. Both are correct. Both convey the same meaning. Both have similar words. Yet as we've seen in the analyses, the diagrams there, each differs from the other in the underlying structure that's being utilized. There are relatively few rules for the creation of a basic declarative sentence. Subject equals noun phrase plus verb phrase, or some manipulation of that. And at its simplest form, such a rule is really quite simplistic in what it allows us to do. Sentence equals subject plus predicate. That's all we need. But our goal finally is to develop a simple kind of set of rules by which we can transform or rewrite or expand the sentiment that has been communicated. And so basically transformations are rules that map tree structures onto other tree structures. How you get from sentence A to sentence B, or sentence 1 to 2, 3 to 4, any of the pairs that I've presented to you. So for instance, let's start with the following as a diagram. Okay, we're going to start out with the sample sentence, you solved those problems. Simple declarative sentence. And then we can transform it in a number of different ways. Okay, for instance, one, we can turn it into a passive sentence. Those problems were solved by you. Same basic perspective, same meanings communicated, but now it's done in the passive voice. Whoops, I'm going the wrong direction again here. Well, what's happening? There we go. A negative transform is another possibility. You didn't solve those problems. Passive negative, we can combine those two and turn it into those problems weren't solved by you. We can turn it into a question. Did you solve those problems? We can turn it into I can't read the left side of the screen there, but what it says is passive interrogative, okay? Weren't those problems solved by you? We're going to keep the engineer busy this morning, shuffling our screen back and forth a bit, but that's a passive interrogative that's raised there. Another possibility is an imperative. Solve those problems. Do that homework. Finish that reading. Whatever mom says to you. And then finally, if you actually do it, she will exclaim, how you solved those problems. All of those basically take that same basic starting sentence up there that we originally gave you, and convert them simply through various kinds of various kinds of transformations. So transformational grammar allows any one of the pairs of sentences that I showed you earlier to be transformed into the other one, following the rules of transformational grammar. I'm going to come back and remind you of something we've talked about here a couple of times before, simply because it may make more sense to you now to define or redefine deep structure as essentially a syntactic structure underlying sentences that links phrase structures through the application of various transformation rules. Now I can give you a full technical definition of a deep structure. And in turn, the surface structure then are simply the various phrase structures that result from syntactic transformations. Notice, however, that whereas surface structure describes an extant sentence, that is what we've actually uttered or read in some way, many have misread Chomsky to mean that intended meaning is what's inferred or identified by deep structure. He was merely trying to demonstrate that deep structure, that is applying transformational rules, will reveal the precise nature of the relationship between two surface structures. That is, in a tree diagram, you can understand, for instance, how such a thing could be used to pull out a pun and identify that if you read a sentence in one way, it has one meaning, which may be quite funny, when in fact you use a different meaning of the word or a near rhyme of it, and the sentence structure may be quite different and convey very clearly what's relayed in either case there. So he was merely trying to demonstrate that the deep structure will reveal the precise nature of what the relationship is between two surface structures, even if there's an ambiguity in how you hear them or can interpret them. For instance, let me give you a differentiating example here. When your husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, or friend says, with respect to a social invitation, "Are you sure you want to go?" They're not really asking about your intent and desires relative to that. You know that the underlying meaning in that case is the speaker is saying, "I'd rather stay home." "Are you sure you want to go?" is really not asking that question at all. There's no commonality between the syntactic structure of his or her question and the deep structure of what he or she is actually communicating in that situation. There's no shared deep structure in those two situations, so we just have to have other ways in which we understand what the actual meaning is of that kind of a message, so that by contrast, what a psycholinguist would infer is the existence of a common deep structure from any sense that is simply a passive transformation of the same structure in the active mode. And finally then, we're going to conclude our tour of language by looking at discourse, which is going to be our next topic, and we're going to be studying language here, use beyond sentences in things like conversations, in paragraphs, stories, chapters, or books. And we'll examine that in our next lecture, which we're going to start now, which is section 17, lecture 17, on the production of language. So today we're going to discuss our production and use of language as we communicate with one another. What I'm going to do is deviate quite sharply from the Matlin text here because her coverage is quite thorough on the topics she covers. But I'm going to introduce a couple of others that are quite relevant, as you'll see as we get into them, that stand in parallel to the kind of issues that she discusses in this chapter in her book. One of the more interesting questions regarding language that I'm going to address here concerns whether, for instance, men and women, speak the same language. There's some evidence to suggest that we really don't. Okay? To the extent that you believe the literature on sex role stereotyping, it almost seems that as we're educated differently, as we endure different experiences, our language pool, indeed the very way we use our language, may in fact differ man versus woman, or woman versus man. Deborah Tannen wrote a really fascinating bestseller back in 1990 that's called You Just Don't Understand, Men and Women in Conversation. Or maybe we should say in miscommunication. As a sociologist, Tannen argues that boys and girls learn to communicate differently through same-sex social interactions and experiences in childhood. That is, the fact that you and I grew up either in a boys' gang or a girls' cluster or association or group, social group, whatever. The result is that other sex interactions result in differing styles. And the net result of that is oftentimes very predictable: miscommunication and or frustration. Hence the title that she came up with, You Just Don't Understand. Because men and women approach social interactions from very different perspectives. Stress the word very. These differing perspectives, in some instances, are actually conflict producing. She focuses on the differences, she meaning the author, focuses on differences between what we may think we're saying in contrast to what we're actually saying. Okay? That is what we think we're saying as opposed to what's being received, what's being understood by that other person, whoever you're talking to. The solution may be that in the members of each sex seeking to understand the perspective of the other, that improving communication is basically going to be an effort to try to understand the frame of reference of the other person. And so what she identifies that as is a meta-message, essentially. It involves the attitudes, feelings, and status information behind the actual words that we speak. And therein she's reflecting a female perspective versus a male perspective on any particular communication. What she says is essentially that meta-messages frame a conversation much as a picture frame provides a context for the image in the picture. That's on page 33 of her original publication there. As an example, consider a man who considers himself to be chivalrous. Courteous would be the word that he would be more likely to use. So he holds the door for a female and signals to a woman, come on through, steps back out of the way and signals to her to precede him through the door. A female, on the other hand, this implies or lays into that, interprets it as a significant status difference. And it's a framing problem, because basically what's at issue there is power. Because the very idea that one person has stood back and held the door, for me, I was trained, 50 some odd years ago to do that kind of thing, and it was strictly a gesture of courtesy. There was a real sex difference in the way little boys and little girls were brought up. Hell, 60 years ago now. Oops, 60 years ago now. And it was simply a courtesy. A boy always did that for a girl. But the association now is that women can proceed. A male holds a door for a female, but in essence, he is simply stepping out of the way as a matter of courtesy. That's his perspective. Her courtesy is that she can proceed, not because it's her right, but because the man has given permission. That's where the difference in perspective really focuses. And that is the fact that the man is simply by training stepping back and holding the door, but a female, equally empowered as an individual, interprets it simply as something having been taken away from her by the very gesture of opening the door. And it's a legitimate alternate interpretation. But what she's arguing essentially is that she has no say, no input into being framed into the subordinate position. Somebody else is directing her. Okay? And that's the difference in perspective that her book is really about. And it's a fascinating book. Those who give have the option, of course, to take away. That's one of the worries. It is this against which women protest when they challenge such actions as holding the door as being chauvinistic. Those who view it as politeness perceive male as polite. It's likely this dimension is all that is being observed when a man is performing that generous gesture, at least from his perspective, but not from hers. This is also the reason why he may be understandably incensed if his gesture generated out of his view of politeness engenders protest rather than thanks. Or the more subtle way in which women put you down now is interesting. They simply walk right through, but there's no thank you. It's simply, I'll go first. And it's an interesting counter, and it's a real negative, essentially a very polite punisher for the audacity of holding a door for someone, which is interesting. You get into I could do a whole seminar just on the logistics of door operation based on the book that we're talking about here. Consider the following, just based on your own social experience. Let's pose these questions to you, and we're going to have a class vote here, and I don't have a lot of time, so just give me an answer one way or the other. Would you agree, true or false, men talk significantly more than women in mixed-sex groups? How many would vote yes, that's true? Well, in fact, let's look at the answer. It is true. It is true. How about women are more likely to ask for help than men? Not just in groups, but in driving. How many would agree with that? There we get general agreement. And in fact, the answer, again, is true. How about number 3? Women are more willing to initiate confrontations in relationships than men. Interesting. That one surprised me, but it also turns out to be true. Okay, well, I'm such a nice person, I've never had to deal with confrontations. Don't believe that for a minute, says he who is twice divorced. Just a relevant data point, that's all I'm introducing there. How about number 4? Men talk more about non-personal issues with their friends than do women. Well, the answer turns out to be true in that case. Men talk more about non-personal issues with their friends than do women. And finally, how about men interrupt women more than women interrupt men in everyday conversation? And the agreement there actually turns out to be true. So all 5 of these basically are statements that are true when you look at mixed-sex interactions. All are true. So apparently there are some differences in the way males and females communicate within and across given sexes. Okay? Men are acculturated, is the word I wrote there. That's kind of sophisticated. Basically, we're acculturated to learn a language of status and independence. And so the net result is that we usually play outdoors, for instance, when we're growing up as boys. We play in larger groups. We're further away from home as children than females typically are. Okay? And so the net result is that we are essentially encouraged to play to win. We are encouraged to defend ourselves in group situations. It becomes competitive, essentially. So males are under less direct supervision, first of all. They're more likely to engage in exploration and independence. And the net result is that boys are usually organized into a high and low kind of status organization. That is, the organization in any boys' group will tend to have a hierarchy of leadership. Somebody tends to lead in a boys' group, others tend to follow, and typically the roles are very seldom reversed. High status roles then involve leadership, telling others what to do and enforcing compliance of the rules, of the unwritten rules of the group. Games usually result in winners and losers in the male training realm, in the childhood of males. So a bid for dominance in this particular situation is based on interruptions, calling each other's names, boasting, and refusal to cooperate with others in the rules. You essentially develop independence by backing away from the group, declaring your independence through your behavior. By contrast now, the interesting thing is that if we look at females, the training is quite different. They tend instead to learn a language of connection and intimacy. They usually play in small groups and pairs. As an example, they often play indoors rather than outdoors. Now, there are other social reasons today why that may tend to happen given sexual molestation of youngsters as we become more sensitive to that. But essentially what they do is to gain high popularity, gain high status through popularity, where the key to success is intimacy with their peers. That's what's driving a female-female kind of group. Games tend not to have winners or losers. It's kind of the progress of the game. I used to hate Monopoly because it requires a lot of, I still don't like it as a game. But during my childhood, you know, you're of course being trained in all your social interactions to win. And of course, most of the fun of Monopoly is the strategy and how you ultimately end up dominating the thing. But it's really the interaction that may go on for 2 or 3 hours, only to come to the last move where somebody gets the last of your money from you. So, oh yeah, you win. And that's kind of, But in essence, that's a kind of a class example of I won't go so far as to ask whether women are more likely to like Monopoly than the men, but I would argue that that's probably true, simply because that's an example of where really the fun in Monopoly is the game playing itself, more so than the actual declaration of winner. But I didn't used to like it as a kid because it took so long to figure out who was the winner, and that's what I was really being trained to do in that situation. Now, in essence, girls do tend to compete, but name-calling is frowned upon. Boasting is frowned upon, okay? Suggestions are expressed as wishes, not demands or orders, in a typical girl-girl group communication. As Eleanor Maccabee notes in a 1990 book, she argues that among boys, speech serves largely egoistic functions and is used to establish and protect an individual's turf. Among girls, conversation is a more socially binding process. Men see the social world as hierarchical, as another example. Okay? High status is needed to maintain independence and avoid failure. I'm getting behind myself here. I'll eventually figure it out. And so basically, high status is needed to maintain independence and to avoid failure, looking among men. Thus, conversations are negotiations in which people try to achieve and maintain the upper hand, if they can, and protect themselves from others' attempts to put them down or push them around. That's from Tannen's 1990 text. Women, on the other hand, tend to see, and I'm getting ahead of myself, my apologies for that, but I'll get it straightened out here in a minute. Women, on the other hand, tend to see the social order as a community, basically in which individuals are connected to others, and the task is to preserve those connections. That's a key element. Okay, and therefore conversations are essentially, as Tannen describes them, negotiations for closeness, in which people try to seek and give confirmation and support and to reach consensus. They try to protect themselves from others' attempts to push them away, to distance themselves. And so what we end up with is essentially there is a multicultural difference that occurs here. And it includes, among other things, linguistic style. The worldview of men and women is quite different based on what their goals are. And the multicultural difference that develops includes things such as the instrumental style that you use. In your conversations, instrumental style involves focus on reaching practical goals and finding solutions to problems. Someone who speaks that way is using an instrumental style. But there's another way to speak, and that is instead to use what is called an expressive style. And that is basically characterized by the ability to express tender emotions easily and to be sensitive to the feelings of others. And so what men tend to do is to use instrumental styles basically in conflict. What they tend to do is to stay calm and problem-oriented and working toward compromise. Now, I'm not talking about individual exceptions here because I'm sure you can cite them. But the general style of men, as described by the author, is to say that in conflict they tend to stay focused on calmness, problem-oriented, and working toward a compromise if a leadership position is not at issue in this situation. But that leads to a problem, and that is that once calm changes to cold responsiveness, unresponsiveness, it becomes very negative, characterized, for instance, by rigidity. So that the style, although it's goal-oriented, if the goal becomes too intense, more what has to be achieved, the net problem is much more the strategy, the way in which the male talks becomes much more negative in its overall approach, rigid, uncompromising, and so forth. Women, on the other hand, are better at nonverbal communication, a key element of the expressive style. They're better at listening. They're better at consoling the depressed, just to give you three examples of the difference in stylistic achievements in this. The problem is, in this situation, and that is that they're more likely, first of all, to display strong negative emotions when those are appropriate in a situation. They also tend to use psychological coercion. Okay? Things such as psychological coercion, tactics like guilt, verbal attack, or power plays, linguistically speaking. And therefore, what they also tend to do is to tend to send double messages. They reject attempts at reconciliation, and they send double messages. Not intentionally, it's just the way it happens, given the function of education. So, they're looking at you making a particular statement, focusing on, for instance, making a negative statement while smiling. I really don't agree with you. That's a double message. I really don't agree with you. So they're telling you to go to hell, but they're doing it in the most beautiful facial expression. And the snickering around the room suggests that I really have nailed something, that Tannen really has done a very interesting job of psyching out what males and females do with our various language. Not all the problems in communication are based, of course, on gender issues. We'll address more of the issues related to developing linguistic skills when we get to the last two lectures on developmental cognition later on. But in turn, let's look into then the to speak perchance to be heard, and that is the values of discourse itself. Okay, what we're going to look is essentially at the variety of skills that go into a casual conversation or reading. For instance, word recognition is one of the things that we actually have to master in this particular situation. We have to fit words into context to determine the meaning. A given word in a particular situation, one of the common phrases now that has arrived in the late 80s, late teens, tens is what we're in here, the zeros of 2000, is the idea of saying to somebody, you're so bad. And really that's not the intent at all, to talk about bad behavior. It's really to compliment somebody or say they're cool, they're with it, they've got a good suggestion, their attitude is very positive. But in essence, in that case, if you're talking to an older person, you can't really look at somebody who's 70 and say to them, you're so bad. Because they will take you literally. They'll start looking, what is my shirt unbuttoned? Did I say something wrong, or so forth? So that basically you simply got to that's one among the many things that are involved in skilled discourse as we communicate with each other. Another thing you've got to do is to pay attention to the rules that constitute a sentence. Every now and then when you're talking to somebody or listening to somebody, you will hear them start into a multi-word, many-phrase sentence, and they get lost. And the usual effect in that situation is they simply cut it off. They simply stop. Or they'll interrupt themselves with something like, what I'm really trying to say is, and they'll simply lay it out again in 5 words, which is what they should have done to begin with. So in essence, you and I do have to cater to what our English teachers burdened us with way back in elementary or high school, and that is we generate full sentences. We don't tend to speak in phrases. We tend to generate a subject, a verb, and something that we're talking about in that situation. Rules governing what constitutes a good flow in reading or conversation. That also is an element. You can't jump in the middle of a conversation with someone who's got a problem with a boyfriend or girlfriend by suddenly introducing the idea, I just got a new car. It's totally off the wall relative to what's tied the two of you together in a fairly intimate conversation, and that's one of the rules that we have to impact and be aware of when we're involved in discourse. In addition to, there are also kinds of various limits on processing, such as linguistic relativity, which we're going to talk about here in a minute, short-term memory, and the gender of the person to whom you're talking. All of those limit. For instance, in short-term memory, if you're asking people to remember something, you will tend to cluster. If you can, you'll pre-cluster the material, simply because it makes it easier. If you're talking about roses and you name a whole bunch of different roses, you may organize it by color or prickliness of the spines or whatever. But in essence, it's in some ways, given all the rules we have to follow, most of them are unconscious. We're really not even aware of them, even though we do them. But in essence, it's a wonder that we can communicate at all in these kind of situations. But what I'm dealing with here really is a subject that I do want to define for you, and that is discourse. And we define that simply as a verbal exchange, including conversation, or a formal and lengthy discussion of a subject, whether written or spoken. So discourse clearly involves units of language that are larger, more complex than individual sentences. That is, there is a broader topic anytime you're involved in a conversation. There is the overall message that you're trying to communicate to somebody, but there is in addition the details of how you actually do it. The individual sentences are important, but the fundamental goal when you get in a debate with someone is to win, is to convince them that you're trying to arrive at a reasonable solution to whatever disagreement you may have in that kind of a situation. The best in that would, of course, be a mutually beneficial win-win situation, is sometimes described that way. The most dissatisfactory kind of event that you and I get into is a lose-lose situation, where both people walk away seriously annoyed, not having achieved what they came into the conversation to do. And there are various other combinations that can come out of that. But that's one of the factors that is ultimately driving any conversation, not any, but many conversations that you and I have. Certainly when you're interacting with a clerk in trying to return a product that simply either didn't fit or didn't do what you bought it for or something like that, what's the goal that's driving it is the clerk wants to retain the sale and you want to return the product. So there's a kind of a fundamental difference there. And what you're going to have to find is some way to wend yourself to whatever is the best goal that can be achieved in a bad situation. That's among the things that governs conversation. Lectures. I deliver these theoretically in 75-unit lengths. But you will find occasionally the lectures run a little short. There are other times when I've simply skipped material because there's so much stuff. You'll see things occasionally in the book which accompanies the course that I don't end up talking about, and that was simply edited out because there was not time available. But that's one of the rules of lectures. It starts at a bell, it has to finish at a bell. And the difficulty with television is you can't necessarily say, well, we'll carry that over to next time. I simply violate that rule. So that makes the lectures a little more difficult to say, we start here, we start here. But that's normally what's involved in a lecture. If you go to hear somebody talking about birding on the southwest Texas coast, you expect it to start at a given time, end at a given time, and deal specifically with birding, not used car purchase or anything like that. So there are a number of different rules that we use. Another is stories. You've handed in essays in the fundamental English courses here at the University of Houston, and you've sometimes had people fire right back at you something like bad start, or edit the start, or something like that. Or the worst, of course, is at the end they say, what's your point? And that's a kind of a ringing condemnation. But what it has to do with is the fact that when you and I write a story, whether we print it or tell it, there's a beginning, there's some kind of middle, and there's an ending. The master of that is, of course, Garrison Keillor, who tells a story every Saturday night on his Prairie Home Companion show. And it's a kind of a running mythical town that does not actually exist, but the story is so smoothly told that many people are convinced that there is, in fact, that town. I can't remember the name of the village. Obegon, there we go, thank you. Lake Wobegon, there we go. It does not actually exist. It's interesting that the stories that he tells are exactly tied to the weather in St. Paul, if you follow it. But in fact, that's where the show is based, and that's what the story is wound around. But it's a mythic Lake Wobegon, which does not actually exist. And his stories typically will focus on a given person or a given event or something like that. There's a starting point, there's a midpoint, and there's an end point. And you and I, at least listeners of the program, have been with him long enough that he can just start kind of what seems like midstream to people that just drop into the program for the very first time. But in fact, each story is about a given person or an event or that city or something related to it, things that we've been told in the past about given individuals. And so he's following the rules of stories in that case, in that instance, verbally told ones. Essays the same way, even textbooks. In fact, even bathroom wall discussions. You do not tend, when you read the graffiti in bathrooms, tend to find, if there's a given comment that is evocative of responses, the responses tend to be on target. That is, they don't tend to tell you, I met an interesting person the other day, if it's more vulgar and not related to meeting people. That's just an irrelevant comment, and it doesn't tend to show up on the bathroom wall. The comments that are around whatever one is the focal point are relevant to it. They're tied in some very direct way. So those are just part of the rules that you and I respond to anytime we get into a conversation. In fact, to show you some of the unwritten rules, I'm going to give you an example on screen here. What I'm going to do is to give you 4 sentences. And you'll be amazed the knowledge that you actually use to interpret them. But consider the following, okay? We start with a sentence. The man wanted to have a date for a dance. The man called a woman to inquire of her interest and availability on the date of a dance. She accepted his invitation. The couple attended it and had a good time. Does that strike you as a relatively complete story? Because it communicates the essence of somebody wanting to have a date to accompany him to a dance. He found someone who had time available. She agreed to go along with him, and so forth and so on. But if you think about it, there are several things built into that conversation that are not immediately obvious. For instance, let me pose the following question to you. How do you define the word date in those two conversations, in that essay, in that description? And if you think about it a minute, you find that you just rolled right over the fact that in the first case, the date was simply somebody to accompany him. And yet in the second case, what we're dealing with is specifically the date on which the dance was held. You know, I'll bet that didn't even enter your head when you were listening to that story, that date use. That's the knowledge that you and I base our conversations on. We carry around a whole bunch of kind of ground rules that are never actually expressed. Nobody ever points them out, but that's a rather interesting example of one. At least I found it interesting, so you'll be stuck with being entertained by my interests here. But let me raise another one. To what does it refer in that essay? Because it is a pronoun, it's a general term. What does it actually refer to in there? The man? The woman? No, what does it actually refer to? And I mean the word there. It refers to the dance. Okay? The couple attended it, meaning they attended the dance and had a good time. Ask you another one. Same level. What does she refer to in that situation? That is the woman in the story. But in fact, it's never spelled out. You and I simply assume, since it's woman, we have a particular pronoun to refer to women, and that's obviously what it referred to. But it isn't obvious unless you speak English. And it isn't obvious to a speaker of English unless it's been specifically defined that she is the pronoun that applies to women generically. Okay? And there's several different ways in which you can define the only situations in which she can legally be used in a conversation. I don't mean suit legally, but in fact by obeying the various rules that are involved in generating language in a given situation. And so can we assume, for instance, in this story, as you continue looking at it for a minute, can we assume that he picked her up for the dance, or did they arrive separately? That's also not discussed in that situation, in that scenario. And yet the vast majority of us assumed that by the agreement that they were going to go to the dance, that since he extended the invitation, he would drive to her house or apartment or wherever, her residence, and pick her up. It's never stated, and yet it didn't cause you any discomfort in coming to an understanding of what was being communicated in that situation. In the second sentence, why does the precede date, and yet a precedes dance? Because as we demonstrated here last time, or a couple of lectures back, using a whole bunch of sentences where we talk about a communicates something very different in terms of the specificity and the relevance to us individually than when we're identifying something as the. Because in the, we're talking about a specific dance, a specific this, a specific that. In a, we're just using a general phrase, a general identifier. There's no specific personal relevance when I talk to you about a, where there is about the. I won't, for instance, in describing what's about to happen in the course here, given that we're reaching the 2/3 mark, I don't talk about we may have a exam, an exam. Bad language there. In fact, I will talk about the exam, and you will know immediately that I'm not talking about the third and final, which come at the end of the course, but rather, in fact, the upcoming exam, the next exam in line. And that comes back to the question related to that story, and that is why in fact is the in the second sentence does the precede date, and yet a precedes dance in that same sentence. It impacts the way in which vaguely what I would argue is that what it's doing is talking about the relative vagueness of the dance, and that is that the dance is, yes, it's out there. There is a dance that will be held, but we're not specifically committed to negotiating about the dance. There may be other things going on that particular night. All of these are features of our knowledge on which our ability to participate in discourse is based. We can't jump into the conversation without all these kind of ground rules that have been spelled out and in fact are accepted. We, as speakers of English, we simply adapt and agree with those ground rules because it makes conversation so much easier. I mean, I described to you a complete typical scenario, male inviting female to dance, could today just as easily work the other way around. But once those two roles had been specified, many other assumptions are made about the sequence in which things actually happen based on our knowledge, based on our experience, but not at all spelled out in the sentences that I actually use to describe the scene to you. So now let's look at another factor. Let's look at specifically the factors that influence discourse, and that puts us right into a major controversy in language. It has been over the last half century, basically. It's called the linguistic relativity hypothesis, and it's based on the fact that Chomsky's treatment of language is not tied to any one language. He deals in universals. He's really talking about language as a generic feature of human communication, not English, not French, not any specific language. His analysis is based on deep structures and transformations. Those are the fundamentals that he's talking about in the theory as he enunciated, his theory as he enunciated. At both semantic and phonemic levels, that is at both the levels of meaning and actual pronunciation, languages are not the same. One language will express something with one set of phonemes and another may typically uses a completely different set of phonemes. But these surface structure differences are what are addressed by the linguistic relativity hypothesis. I'm going to end up arguing against it, but I'll show you the evidence that is used to marshal that kind of defense. And the best that can be said about it is basically that it's looking at surface structure differences, not deep structure differences. So this hypothesis actually encapsulates the idea that language influences both the linguistic perception and the conceptualization of reality. That is, that's what the linguistic relativity hypothesis is arguing, and I'll get to the elements of it here in a few minutes. But it's basically arguing that language drives thought. That's the fundamental element of the thing itself. So in essence, hypothesis, the original hypothesis, the linguistic relativity hypothesis, is attributable to Edward Sapir, but more often to his doctoral student by the name of Benjamin Lee Worf. He was the one who is generally credited with developing the linguistic relativity hypothesis. And Worf himself was an interesting individual. He was trained, educated as a chemical engineer at MIT. And his main job was as an insurance underwriter and decision maker at Hartford Fire Insurance Company. Has a slightly different name now. But he actually studied North American Indian languages purely as a hobby. He'd never had a formal appointment in psycholinguistics or a language department or English or anywhere else in the academy broadly interpreted. He was struck in his studies by the structure of different languages, emphasizing different aspects of the world. That was the observation that he came to. He believed that these differing emphases or differing focal points of the language essentially led to different differing conceptualizations of the world and understandings of that same world. So he kind of backed into the linguistic relativity hypothesis by arguing essentially that because the languages are different, when those languages are used to describe things, what they end up doing is creating different images or understandings of reality based on the language that's been used. The classic example that he's arguing essentially that language drives thought. The classic example that is cited is the fact that Eskimos have many different words for snow. Quite understandable. They live in a region that is constantly, seemingly bombarded by snow any month of the year, literally. But they have words for moist snow. They have words for packed snow, wind-driven snow, slushy snow, and many others could be described, but they have separate, different words in the language that Eskimos use, the various languages that Eskimos use. And yet in English, we have only one word, snow. And the way we qualify, the way we reach the definition of the different terms that are utilized by those speaking Eskimo languages is to use adjectives. So we talk about it's snowing outside, but then we ask, you may ask, is it dry? Meaning, will it blow off the highway so I can get from here to home before it really becomes a problem? Is it frozen? well, it is frozen, but is it congealed into ice is what I was really driving at there. We don't differentiate that. Snow is snow as far as we're concerned in its various many forms. And yet if you get socked in the back of a head with a well-packed snowball up north somewhere, you can understand the difference between packable slushy snow and wind-driven light snow. There is a difference, but we do it by adjectives. That's the way we gain the extra flexibility in language. Other examples can be cited here of the same process that I'm identifying here. One of them is the Hanunu, which is a group in the Philippines who have 92 different names for various varieties of rice. Okay, so the Eskimos have many, many words for snow. The Hanunu have 92 different words for types of rice, styles of rice, and so forth. Okay, Arabic languages name camels in many different ways, depending on their use, depending on their structure and suitability for this, that, and the other kind of activity. Worf, in fact, believed that different numbers of terms for a given concept could cause those with more words to perceive items more richly labeled differently than those whose language had only a single concept or referent to that particular concept. It's actually spelled out in terms of the linguistic relativity hypothesis in terms of two different statements. And these are basically the idea that anything represented by a word is conceptualized differently by people to the extent that their language differs. He's arguing again that the conceptualization itself differs as a function of the language that is used to describe it and identify it. And secondly, what Worf also concluded after his study of North American languages in general was he was arguing essentially that the nature of language itself is the cause of those different perceptions and conceptions. Worf actually observed that specific translation from one language to another is impossible. I used to find that extraordinarily frustrating when I studied German as an alternate language in high school. It just drove me bananas when I would have a 4-word sentence that ended up yielding 5 words in English. It just didn't seem to me natural that you didn't have a word-for-word translation. But that, in fact, is at the heart of what Worf based his linguistic relativity hypothesis on. That is that you and I, well, and you've seen it in the various examples that we've used here. For instance, when I'm talking about well, there are a couple of different ways to demonstrate it. One was I talked about a study done by James Jenkins one time where he took 36 photographs of the overall process of starting with nothing on the kitchen cabinet and generating a cup of tea. And then he actually posed a test to people. He would show people 18 of the slides. And just like with our language and the speaking of it, a number of people made a number of assumptions. And so when they were actually shown the entire 36 slide sequence later, they had a way high number of false positives on slides that they had not actually seen. It was a slide integrated into the overall element of making contributions to making a glass of tea or cup of tea, but in fact they had not been shown. And so in that case, the language had basically. Let me back up a little bit so I don't get you confused here. What I'm doing is drawing the parallels to the number of different pictures that could be used to describe the manufacturing of a cup of tea and the number of different words that we could use. When you and I get in a conversation, we don't often use all the details. We'll simply say, I made a cup of tea. We don't say, I got the sugar, I got the cup, I got the tea, I got the strainer, I got the, whatever that little gizmo is that sits on the bottom. I can never remember the name of it, that you don't, so you don't have glass on the burner. I didn't get, you don't do that. You just say, I made a cup of tea. And that implies all those other things. But the level of specificity is much more general in that kind of a situation. But he found in various languages, I skipped a point that I was going to make there. It'll come to me and I'll come back to it. But in essence, what he was saying was that in the various languages that he was studying, the nouns and verbs are not clearly distinguished in all languages. Secondly, the past, present, and future tense is ambiguous in certain languages, and therefore converting from one to another can also become very confusing. Another thing that he observed is that in some languages there is no distinction between, for instance, gray and brown, which is for you and I, well, it's very obvious. That's a brown, that's a gray. I have an interesting situation at home, and that is one of my two cats is a Burmese, and it's called a Burmese Blue, which is actually a newly developed strain of Burmese kittens, and the color that he has is gray. But when I look at him, I can very clearly see brown tints, given his lineage that I know, of which I'm aware. But many other people are not able to see it, and I'm sure it's partly based on the fact that my observations are biased by the fact that I know where the cat came from. And Burmese are fundamentally a dark, rich sable brown in fundamental color. This one happens to be a dark, rich gray. Very different. I'm a bit off topic here. Tolerate it a little bit. Despite clear evidence that we all have common perceptual physiological apparatus, there's no argument about that. English does not make each of the distinctions that other languages make. That's the fundamental driving force behind this. What it led to was a very sophisticated study of color names, color ranks, and names that can be utilized here. So that basically, let me just show you and talk a little bit about three languages that I want to cite here, for instance. I'm going to look at three different languages here. English, of course, is easy. We all speak it and we understand what it's referring to. So that language itself uses words as you see there: purple, blue, green, yellow, orange, and red. We're all familiar with those. Okay? The Shona, on the other hand, which are basically, that's a language that is spoken, I shouldn't say the Shona. Shona as a language is spoken in Zimbabwe. And that language, in fact, divides the color spectrum quite differently. So if you take the colors that are seen there, the kind of standard, in our case, 6 of the fundamental colors as we identify them, in the Shona, you'll actually see that the left and the right of the organization that I've proposed there is actually identified by the same word. And yet there are two other colors in the blue range and in the greenish-yellow range that have another word. And so those who speak Shona actually have only 3 different colors that they identify, 3 different color words that they use to identify various colors. The third one that I'll show you is Basa, and that is even more extreme. That has only 2 words in the entire language that refer to color. You and I might look at that, and about the only way we would be able to get Basa to agree with English would be to use something, for instance, like dark and light. That would roughly cover what's involved there. But of course, you can see some biliously bright reds, or greens for that matter. Excuse me. But in essence, that language has only 2 words that are involved there. The different languages divide the spectrum quite differently, and do so, in fact, at different points. And yet again, as I pointed out, we all have the same visual apparatus for citing color and making discriminations among colors. Because of that difference in mental processing of observed colors, that's what the linguistic relativity hypothesis is going to attribute the difference in language. That is, I'm getting words jumbled here. Stick with me. I will get through this. I always have trouble with the linguistic relativity hypothesis, so grant me some latitude here. But in essence, the driving point is going to be that what we're going to try to do is demonstrate that how you and I perceive the world is not ultimately driven by the language words that I've just attached to you there, or that I've just demonstrated for you. That is, I've identified 3 different languages that clearly take the world of color and divide it up very differently. So now, in fact, what we're going to do is to get into some predictions about whether the linguistic relativity hypothesis is correct or not. And in fact, what we lead to then is a series of predictions like the following. Essentially, a color does not fit in a designated category. Color name should be remembered as a member of a color that it most closely resembles. That is, if we put you into a situation where we're going to give you a whole series of color chips, kind of like those paint chips that you can get at a local paint store, where they'll have you 38 grades of red and 71 grades of yellow and so forth and so on. What they're going to do is to conduct a study in which you're given a gazillion of those chips, a bit overstated, but in essence you're asked to categorize them in any way you want, and then come up with an exemplary color name. In just a second, I'll get to that. But in essence, basically, Eskimos, as I mentioned earlier, are reported to have a number of different names for snow. In addition to the ones I listed, there is also blowing snow, there's drifting snow, There is snow that you can make igloos from. Never would have occurred to me to identify that kind of a word. But clearly that's relevant if you live in igloos. Okay? So they supposedly demonstrate or discriminate many more forms of snow than you and I do. But anthropologist Laura Martin, in fact, says bluntly that Eskimos do not have numerous words for snow. Okay? And in fact, what's going to happen here is that we're going to reach a rather interesting point, as you'll see here in just a minute. G.K. Pullum in 1991 argued that no one who knows anything about the Inuit, a tribe up in the very northern reaches of Canada, and the Yupik families of related languages spoken by Eskimos from Siberia to Greenland, has ever said that they do have that many separate identifying words for snow. That's never been asserted. The Hanunu in the Philippine Islands have 92 identifiable states of rice, as I mentioned earlier. But the linguistic relativity hypothesis, and here's where we're going to have a change, because I had prepared to talk only this far, and so we're going to stumble through the rest of the visuals, which are ready. But I will be a little less graceful in going through stuff than the ineptness that I've demonstrated so far. But in essence, what the opposition did, those that are not in favor of the linguistic relativity hypothesis, was they argue essentially that physical reality is translated into an internal representation of reality, essentially our language or the memories that we store in various ways. And it's consistent with the long-standing cognitive structures that our language has permitted us to develop in a given way. But one of the factors that actually influences information structured in the brain is the specific language code that's developed by the speaker. That's what the linguistic relativity people are arguing, okay? The contrast is argued quite strongly by people like anthropologists Brent Berlin and Paul Kay, who as early as 1969 were studying colors as described by almost 100 different languages, okay? And they found certain basic colors are the same for all languages. So in essence, what we do is to cruise right through that, which is where I thought we would stop today, and in fact go back into an analysis then of the opposition, which is essentially going to study the identification of basic colors. And in fact, the way they did it was to basically establish basic colors for 20 languages. That is, they looked at the different languages and established what that language called basic colors. And then what they did was a multifold study. And that is, first of all, what they did was to ask people, to ask native speakers to identify colors using specific color names from their language. So they're going to show the people a vast array of colors, and then in fact they're going to ask them to use their own language to identify pure colors. That is, to come up they're to identify a series of colors, but they're to come up with words which identify specific colors in that situation. And then they're going to identify in the array of colors that are called by a given name. What they're then asked to do is to rate the color that is best, the color that is most typical for each color. So for instance, they might be given an array of red chips, as you and I would call it. They range all the way from very pink to quite deep lavender. And yet that might all fall in the range of what a language like ours calls red. And then what they were then asked to do, having come up with that identifier, was they were to pick across all the different colors they had, what is the color that best illustrates the color that you've identified, the word that you've identified, okay? So you're looking at you're kind of reversing the normal process that's argued by linguistic relativity. What you're doing now is looking at the colors and pulling out of that the word the particular chip that happens to represent the color that most adequately represents, for instance, red, as an example. And this was in fact called a focal color. So they identified across the array of colors they'd been given the color that was most typical for each color that they separately identified in groups, and it was called then the focal color. And the net result was that the focal colors were very identical across all of the different groups. So it turned out that despite having the difference in language, the colors that were identified as focal, that is typical of a range of colors where from one end to the other, that would be a word that might be used to describe it. It turned out that those words were identical. And in fact, what I'm going to do then is to reach the end of this lecture so that we'll have enough time to be able to go through the material in the 18th lecture coming up, which will be the fourth and final look at, excuse me, how we end up producing language. So we'll come back and pick up a further analysis, because what follows in this study is a depiction of the color, and there is a very predictable array and order in which various colors are picked out. So it turns out, unlike what the linguistic relativity hypothesis is arguing, it's actually the reverse that's going on. That is, if you look at the colors as divided by all the different languages, it turns out there is a very predictable array. There is a natural element in the colors themselves, a natural factor reflected in the nature of the colors themselves, which in turn is converted back into the language. That's going to be the net conclusion. And we'll pick that up at the beginning of Lecture 18, our next one.